Let's go to our text of Scripture then. We are on Esther, chapter 3. And one of the things that we see with this chapter is a sense of the purposes of God that are providential, behind the scenes, but they're there. They're evident. It's palpable. And so he reveals himself in this book, not overtly, but covertly, indirectly, not directly. And he does this in a certain way to show that even when people are not really actively pursuing their God or following the mandates of Scripture, he's still going to be keeping his covenant, even in spite of the fact that they are now suffering the consequences of their sin. These are people who are in Persia. They elected these people not to return. There were 3 deportations and there were 3 returns after that. And it was from the Babylonian captivity, and subsequently the Persians conquered the Babylonians. So by now we're in Persia, but this is a story after the Jews had returned, but these ones had not, and the majority did not. They were throughout the 127 what's called satraps of the basically arenas or city-states. They were just whole areas, and they were throughout the Persian Empire. So there were 127 of these things that went from Egypt all the way to almost to China. It was a huge empire. It was bigger than the Egyptian Empire, bigger than the Assyrian Empire, bigger than the Babylonian. It was a huge thing. But he had just suffered defeat from the Greeks, and so he was basically Xerxes, who's called Ahasuerus in this, was needing some funds, although he was trying to have a pretense of lavishness. He had a banquet for 180 days for the key princes of these various provinces of Persia. And then they had a 7-day feast for the whole population. So he's giving these extravagant displays of wealth and power. Money, sex, and power is really the name of the game in this book in many ways with this king. And at the same time, you have the coffers are needing to be filled. And that's going to be an interesting thing because it relates to the theme of this particular chapter. Here's a king who is filled with pride, but he's been beaten by the Greeks. And now he needs to find solace, as Herodotus puts it in his histories. He speaks about how after his defeat, he sought consolation in his harem. It's an interesting thing when I think about this guy, because I cannot help but think about the trilogy of money, sex, and power that is so evident. It's always been the case, always been a pull. And I noticed something that's very interesting. My friend Glenn Sunshine called this to my attention. It was intriguing to me, and I never put this together, that the 3 basic monastic vows corresponded quite directly with these 3 basic pulls. So that poverty, the vow of poverty, of chastity, and obedience. And by the way, chastity doesn't require one to be single. It can be chastity in the sense of when you're married, that you are keeping your eyes on Christ and if you're married, the bride you were given, and you focus on that person. And so it's not just a matter of those actions, but your thoughts. It's a whole huge thing about the thought life. And here is a man who's driven in his thought life to promote for prestige, for power, for his own will to be done. He's the iconic image, it seems to me, this king, and then Haman especially. Both of them are men of pride, and one man, Haman, manipulates the one of pride. He manipulates the king and finds ways of currying favor and getting himself through wheedling and manipulating and cajoling, and this especially by giving him a good feeling about himself. Attains a position where he was advanced. So it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. And it's an interesting thing, if you go to Exodus chapter 17, that you have that he was a descendant, apparently, of Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites. And those are the ones who were Israel's sworn enemies for generations. So if I go to Exodus 17, 14 to 16 for a second, you can see that this was a problem because it was a moral that they were to block out the memory of Amalek from heaven, under heaven. And this idea, and then it was against, again, the Saul, when Saul did not actually destroy Agag, the king, but he allowed him to live. So it's a consequence of their disobedience that this man actually comes into his position of power. It always comes down to the question of the authority of God and God's purposes, and whether we were going to listen to them and subject ourselves to them or not. Ultimately, then, he's advanced in authority over all the princes. So almost in saying that he's an Agagite, that he's an enemy of the Jews. And so there was this perennial conflict that was going on. He advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. So the king had commanded concerning him. So it's a matter of prestige, of public persona, of imagery. And again, when a person wants to pursue his own enterprises and not those of God, it's going to be a way of which he's going to be trying to use people in different degrees to manipulate them, to impress them, to control the environment around them. And it seems that this man had no boundary to his arrogance. The fact is that his servants were at the king's gate bowed down, and they paid this apparent respect. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. And then the king's servants called that to his attention. Apparently, didn't see it. And they said who were at the king's gate, they said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he told them that he was a Jew. And although he's a Jew, there's not really a mandate that they're not allowed to acknowledge or bow down. So there was something more going on. And there's been a lot of speculation as to why he would not do it. And I have a suspicion that it was because of the man himself. For him to bow before this person would be a lack of integrity, because he had very clear convictions, and he knew that this man was an enemy of his people. There was a malevolence about him. It's something that strikes me that there was more going on than meets the eye, that there was a spiritual warfare underlying this. And just as there was, since the inception of the Jews, that there has been warfare against them to systematically destroy them, both with the Exodus in Egypt, the Egyptians, as well as with the whole process of the Babylonian captivity, and to eliminate them, and then in this book to eliminate them, and then to eliminate them at other times, and then the Holocaust. You see the Romans and then the Holocaust. It seems that the more they have been given, the more they will suffer, the more opposition they will face. And I find that to be a pretty fascinating reality. At any rate, they told him to see whether his reason would stand. And when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down or paid homage to him, he was filled with rage. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. They told him who the people of Mordecai were. So he decides that he wants to destroy all the Jews, not just this man. So once again, anything that's going to stand against him is going to be something he has to defeat and destroy, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day. Now this was a form of divination that they used. It was not unlike our dice, as it were, but they would cast it for a good reading. And he did it from day to get the right reading, and it was not reading it correctly until finally he got the right, after a while, he kept on going ahead and ahead. Is this the day? Is this the day? Is this the day? And it kept on advancing until finally it went 11 months out, the month of Adar. And it was going to be in that month that the people were to be destroyed. So it's a kind of a demonic calculus as to when is the optimal time to destroy the people. Now this text doesn't mention it, but that turns out to be Passover. Now it turns out that it appears that Mordecai and Esther were Jews, but not practicing Jews. And it doesn't, again, there's not a directness of this, but it was, in fact, on the day of it was going to be in Passover that they were going to be attacked. it's almost like a diabolical thing behind the scenes to defeat and destroy the people. And so we can see that with this casting of this, then it seems that the enemy, Satan, the demonic forces, made it stop or made it read the right reading when it came to that month. So he was just going for the date to date. Is this the right day? Is this the right day? As he went forward. It's an odd practice, and we don't know much about it. But ultimately, though, it's more diabolical than one would imagine, because it's not a matter of personal offense, but is empowered by the enemy, in my view, to actually defeat and destroy the purposes of God through his people. Their laws, he said, that, there's a certain people, so he goes to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered, and they're dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. So he's a certain people, he doesn't even call them Jews, but he's saying, so he's giving them the impression that there's some rabble then in his kingdom. Just give me the permission to destroy them. It'll be better for you. And so if it's pleasing to the king, he wants them to be destroyed. Then he says, I'm going to pay 10,000 talents of silver. That's a huge amount. It's almost the entire revenue of the Persian Empire in a year. And so it was an amazing thing. Where's he going to get this money from? There's been some speculation. Did he have money? It seems it's most likely that he was going to come out of the revenues from the destroyed Jews. So that very likely when they are all murdered, they'll be able to take those funds and use them, and that would replenish the king's court. So he says, okay, he didn't even tell them they were Jews, just a certain people who are not following your laws. So he downplays that, but he appeals to his ability to get back his coffers, get them filled with this extraordinary amount of wealth, and put it in the king's treasuries. So the king took a signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And so it's almost gives him like a title. The king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people are also to do with as you please. So he says, okay, this will be yours, and you're going to use this and take it from them, and it'll go to the empire. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. It was written just as Haman commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people, each province according to its script. So they had to have these translators, and each of this 27 provinces, they had to have the right script. They had to have basically it was the Pony Express. And so you were going throughout the empire to get this message out. And you can imagine the horror, the fear, the consternation this caused, because they have all this time in advance to prepare for the fact that the Persians are going to be allowed to destroy them. So you can imagine the intensity that this would have, this ominous reality, that the letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. So it was going to be in that holy day that they were going to be allowed to be destroyed. So the consternation, the fear, the horror that issued throughout the entirety of the empire is hard to understand. A copy of the edict is to be issued as law in every province and was published to all the people so that they would be ready for this day. The couriers went out impelled by the king's command while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa, while the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Susa was in confusion because there were many Jews who were there. So here you have an extraordinary story, and it's about an extraordinary malevolence, and it illustrates a number of things. The thing that I discover, though, is that any one of us can succumb to this pull of pride in ways that are hard for us to conceive. We can rationalize our own fantasies and so forth. But when I seek to go against God's purposes and to find myself pursuing my own purposes, it's going to lead to a kind of a friction between his ways and my ways. And so if I allow that sloppy thinking that for me to actually distort that, I'm going to be pursuing agendas that will not be for his purposes. So I need to constantly find myself pulling myself back in and recalibrating and remembering, why am I here this day? What is this day about? Is it about myself, or is it about God? Because if it's about me, I'm going to be deceiving myself and manipulating people. Not to this degree. This is beyond imagination. But nevertheless, it's going to be something that will be destructive and destroy and diminish the purposes of God for his people. So there are some things that are to be learned about this. And the thing about this is that when I do not grasp the darkness of my own desires and deceits, I can miss out on the purposes of God. This has always been a fundamental issue, is the question of whose truth is it? And so when you lose there is one thing I can find right away that I think is worth showing to you again, because it has to do with the issue of truth and reality. It has to do with our culture. And there are 8 components that I find myself alluding to. And I've shown you this before, but it's worth a look. That when you're dealing with critical thoughts, identity politics, and postmodernity as one of the components of our time, it moves you away from a clear understanding of truth to something that is relativized. Then a second component in our force in our time is that we've been so mediaized into cultural imbecility that we can't really think clearly. Yeah. It's amazing how people buy into it, and it's a gradual process. Again, it's the Rip Van Winkle cycle. Imagine if a person, instead of his time, suppose you were in 1950 and you woke up and it's 2020, just not even our time. Suppose it was 1920, you woke up in 2024. You'd have the same effect. It would just be more extreme, you see. Less extreme, but it would be there. My point is, it keeps on gradually progressing. And then third is AI and immersion in dark, doubtful digital spaces. So the power of technology in that area, digital technology, is getting rapidly greater. And then social media, with the posing and preening and posturing and positioning, the nonsense that you see where people are not even presenting their true selves, but images of themselves, where they have no friends, but they think they have friends in numbers, but actually not a one of them cares for them. Essentially, it's just they're not friends, they're friends without friends. The collective autism, I call it collective autism, collective apathy, collective anger, and amnesia. Unique things. People are not able to even relate as well to one another. They're not as comfortable in being connected in that way. So that's part of the loneliness that it produces. Then a degeneration of culture carriers, of film and television. Just think about what's happened. If I'm just comparing it with 5 years ago, I can remember some shows that were on. People are in these shows, so they have them in the 18th century, swearing worse than sailors. It's more than anything you can begin to imagine. It's an absurdity, and all the wokeness that also distorts realities in every direction, and everything. All these kinds of components we can close. We don't want that over. What you see here is an incredible sense of moving away from authenticity and integrity to a sense of a loss of a cultural mandate, a loss of a sense of a cultural grasp of reality. That there seems to be in many lives today a loneliness, a disconnection, and a lack of, more and more in our culture, the diminishment of reason and the diminishment of empiricism. Instead of basing on reason and logic and on evidence, it's now the autonomous self. And so as a consequence of that, anything's up for grabs. So when ideology trumps biology, you get into new categories that were never even thought of or conceived of before. When there is a loss of a moral consensus, you also have this problem. There's fundamental issues of life, or one of the fundamental issues of life is there any meaning? Who am I? Is there any purpose? Is there any hope? By focusing on these fundamental needs that we have, I think it can be a very helpful way of going about it. Rather than just going down to politics or something like that, I can go straight to the real issues of issue matters. Where do we come from? Where do you think you come from? And if it's just the impersonal time and chance, then how does that define you as far as meaning is concerned? So we're not embedded in a context in which we have any real meaning because you're just a blip in a cosmic blip. So just asking people these questions and saying, what does that imply for you? And then just do the best while you can because you're out of here. You're just here for a brief moment. You're just an episode between two oblivions. Is what you are. So your life is like a moment in time. There's nothing to you. So the question of identity, or I might ask, how do you know who are you? Who defines who you are? Just simple questions like this that many people, I find, don't ask much. But wouldn't you regard those as important issues? It seems to me that this whole idea of meaning and of identity is a huge issue. I'll put this up here because it's worth your seeing. It brings this to mind. Even though I couldn't find the other one, I can find this one very easily. Still driving me nuts. I'll have it next time. There were a couple. But the question of where did I come from is if I am not coming from a personal source, then I'm just an impersonal byproduct of a chance process where there's no ultimate meaning and purpose and hope. I can try to have a meaning in this life, but what will that do? Oh, but it'll I'll leave a legacy. What happens when they're gone? What happens when there's nobody who remembers what your name is? Your name may be just nothing more than a name on a tombstone, and you're bounded by a couple of dates, but nobody even remembers who you are. It's like taking your photographs out of your house in your boxes and putting them up for a garage sale. Think about that. I'm not even interested in our photograph when it moves more than one, maybe three, who are they? I don't care. They might as well be people from Asia, as far as I know, from Mongolia. I have no more connection than I do with an Inuit. The fact is that there's a connection. If it's not a relationship, there's no real meaning. There's no connection. What happens is, it's like Woody Allen's a great statement. He says, not that I'm afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens. It's actually even better than that, though. He says, I love this. It was asked, do you want to live on in the hearts of your friends? No, he said, I want to live on in my apartment. Because what good will it do me if a million people are singing my praises morning, noon, and night, and I'm gone? But that's the point. What happened? But they're going to remember you. Your friends will remember you. What happens when they're dead? And then whether people who knew them are dead. At the end of the day, it's just a cipher. And people who built vast empires might as well write their names on water for as long as it's going to last. Why don't people think about that? Is what amazes me. I marvel at that. I put the onus on them, and I want them, let's reason together. Let's reason about meaning. Let's reason about identity, about who gets to define you. Is it the people around you? Then you'll be insecure, and the arrogance and insecurity of a Haman becomes the extreme, but at the same time, you can move toward a folly because you're basing yourself on the opinions of and expectations of others. It's not enough. It's got to be something more substantive than that. Why am I here? The question of purpose is a question that's always being raised. And you have to ask, what is my purpose for living in this world? Do I have one? Am I just here to make money and live for my family and then die? There's got to be something more than that, a bigger, larger purpose that contextualizes my life. And where am I going? A sense of hope. And in my view, you were made in the Imago Dei, and as a result, you're God-haunted, and you cannot resist and eliminate the fact that He's constantly pulling on us in our lives. Given this understanding, then we have to see how life does mean something if there's a God, if there's a spirit who transcends matter, space, energy, and time. If there's one who called all those things into being. If there's one who is not a being, but He is the wellspring of all being. That He is the one who is the tripersonal spirit who always exists. And that you were meant for eternity and infinity because you came from His hand. and therefore nothing less will do. That's why Augustine wrote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." And so given that understanding, we have this constant need for us to ask those questions and take the initiative and actually ask them questions rather than I'm on the seat. Does that make sense? It's an approach I try to take, and I find it helps people think through more than they normally have. I'm doing the For Love by C.S. Lewis in my Sunday morning class, and phileo is the love of friendship, and so I spend a good deal of time on that. In fact, it's turning out, it's an interesting combination of things. I'm now doing agape, and it's just expanding itself into an interesting treatment. It's a huge topic, and I don't know if I have so many things I'm working on, but I don't know if that's one thing I should focus on. I'm going to do a booklet on it, though.
Really not doing that.
I think that there's a kind of the need for an other-centeredness that drives a friendship. That it's not about, and it's about having a willingness to open themselves up and to expose themselves, and the measure of accountability that's necessary as well, where you have to have, the more rich a friend is, then it's going to be a painful thing, because it'd be a process of joy and reconciliations as well, of pains that we've experienced together, because people can be the most wonderful things and the most difficult things on the planet. Yeah. It's an important thing, though, for me. I'm rich in relationships. It's just I'm wired that way. I just am very interested in building in friendships, and as a consequence, I'm filthy rich in relationships. Which is a good thing, because that's many men don't have friends. They have acquaintances, but they don't have real friends, and there's a diminishment that is a result of that. I see a spectrum of friendship. I'll put this up here. So you have this casual contact, and then to a companion, and then a colleague. My alliteration is always there. It becomes a comrade, and then a covenant friend. And that seems to me that the covenant friends of life require time, intention, risk, and vulnerability. And there's a terrible weight of love. The weight of love is that you enjoy one another, a true friend will rejoice when another rejoices and weep when another weeps. Many are the people, though, who rejoice when another weeps and weeps when another rejoices. It's very important for us to see, do I take that upon myself and resonate with that in that relationship? It's a measure of time it requires to build it into the relationship. You ever go to a reunion? I hate reunions. I went to one time. I went to my 5-year high school reunion, and I said I'll never go to a reunion again, and I haven't. It was miserable. These acquaintances and you share the commonality. You might one or two stories, and then you realize I'm talking to a complete stranger, because you have to cultivate relationships. It amuses me. I have a card folder. It's of a stack of 3x5 cards. I used to have my cards and addresses and all that in the cards before I had my computer. It's fascinating. I have these cards with names I'll never know who they were, but it must have been important enough for me to write them down at one time and put them together. But now they're totally clueless as to who they are. And even if you run into a person that you've known, you review that, and then do I have anything in common with this person? You may not. So I think most people, it requires a measure of time, a measure of risk. There's a risk and a vulnerability, because the closer you get to a person, the more risk there can be of being hurt and injured, because, again, the most painful and the most wonderful things. I call it the weight of love. The weight of love is that you have the joys of love and the relationship and knowing that the person will be there, especially a covenant friend. But you also have the weight of love that you have to suffer with their suffering. So there's a price to be paid in doing that, price of vulnerability. And there's a tremendous amount of time and effort it requires, really, to sustain and to serve and to support people in our lives. So this is a recent slide I made because of just reflecting upon the nature of this topic. It's pretty important. But going back to these issues, we all struggle with the matter of what is life about? What's the purpose? What's the meaning? And so I'll always ask myself, am I tracking together? Am I heading in the same direction? I had a wonderful Easter with Heather and Karen. And in that context, both of them are diminishing greatly physically. But you know what we spoke about more than any other topic? Guess what we spoke about more than any other topic? About heaven. Because you see, they're going through a great diminishment. And so we spoke about heaven together. Now, there's a deep friendship as well as the other loves. But what you have here is the fact that we are on a heavenly journey. And one of the things that we share in common, you and I, is that we have the same destiny. That's a pretty big thing. You and I share the same destiny, don't we? We're going to the same place. Don't we also share the same identity? After all, God has defined us, if we're allowed, the degree to which we embrace God's view of ourselves is the degree to which we will have an authentic identity. And the more I embrace God's view of me, the more secure I become, and the more I'm able to be alive to the needs of other people. So there's this whole idea of the identity that we have. So we share that same identity. We share that same destiny. We share that same derivation, because are we not all children of the living God? Has he not adopted us into his family? And at the point of our conversion, we were suddenly placed into the line of Christ. Something that happened mysteriously that transcends time and space, because when we came to faith in Christ, then we died with Christ, and we were buried and we were resurrected again with him. It's an amazing thought. So you've been given a new derivation. How does that happen, that God works retroactively in history, gives you a new derivation? He's no longer in the line of Adam, but now you're in a new line, the line of Christ. It's hard to believe. Hard to imagine. So we have the same, so think of what you share with a believer. You share the same dignity, the same derivation, you're saying the same destiny. That's a lot. And then with friends, though, you also have shared common interests and loves, and you share those together as well. There's always going to be a risk involved in that. Yes.
Our role model is you're rich. Work this.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a measure of vulnerability, a measure of time, a measure of risk, a measure of commitment, because the more you have closer to a covenant friend, the more of a commitment you're making. And you can't do this with everybody. But one can have the profoundly interesting and rich friendships, even though it's not a covenant relationship, perhaps. So you have those kinds of things that can happen as well. But each of them has its own cost and a price. You have to be available you have to be faithful and available. Just like a disciple of Christ, when I talk about that, they have to be fat, faithful, available, and teachable, and hot, open, honest, and transparent. To be a disciple of Christ is a condition that relates to being a friend as well. It has its own love. And part of it is to put myself have a right view of myself, to see that everything I have is derivative. Everything is gift and grace. I don't bring anything to the table that wasn't given to me. Nor am I asked to do anything that wasn't given to me as well. I'm invited to forgive people only because I was forgiven. But I was forgiven a great deal more than I'm asked to forgive, and things of that nature. So it seems to me that every time I look at the scriptures, I see them coming at it from so many multiple directions that relate to every component, every sphere of knowledge, of understanding. They all connect together. All truth is a derivative from the mind and the heart of God himself. So it's why I'm still a lover of beauty and truth and goodness. And I see that beauty is all from the hand of God. I see truth is then, beauty points to the truth of God's greatness. And then I think of the goodness that God has in our lives as well. So there's just a powerful picture of a holistic vision of life. So the more rich, the more Christocentric I become, the less egocentric I become, the more other-centered I become, the more, shall I say, I become more a self for others than a self for self. And as a result, then there's a synergy that takes place. And when you have another person doing the same thing, it's a pretty powerful alliance. Looking for those things is very critical. Trying to find hope, trying to have purpose, trying to find meaning in life, and to fix my eyes on the things above and to be more of an eternal perspective than ever before has always been important for me.